Thomas Garrett gazed out the panoramic window of his Bel Air home at the twinkling lights of Los Angeles. 49 years old, and he'd already achieved everything he'd dreamed of. A prestigious architecture firm, the respect of his colleagues, a beautiful wife, a house he'd designed himself, the symbol of his success. But for the past few weeks, an invisible shadow had overshadowed his life. Susan came home later than usual, her hair smelling of cigarette smoke. She never smoked. "I'm sorry, dear." Her voice sounded too carefree. "The client insisted on meeting me after work. You know how it is in advertising." Thomas nodded without turning around. "Dinner's in the fridge. I'll heat it up." "No need. I've had a snack in town." Susan went upstairs to take a shower. Thomas could hear the water running and wondered when exactly their 20-year marriage had gone down the drain. A year ago? 2? Susan used to share every detail of her day with him. Now their conversations were like the small talk of strangers. At breakfast this morning, Thomas again suppressed the impulse to ask a direct question. "I have a meeting with potential investors today, and I'll be back late," he said, sipping his coffee. Susan, 45, still attractive, replied without taking her eyes off the clipboard. "I'm on a tight schedule too. Don't wait up for dinner." "Third time this week," Thomas remarked, trying to keep his voice neutral. She looked up, something like irritation flashing in her eyes. "It's a big project. You know I'm the creative director. It's part of the job." He knew. Had worked overtime himself countless times. But then he'd always call, explain, apologize. Susan would just report the fact and expect him to take it for granted. Thomas felt a familiar tugging pain in his lower abdomen. It had been bothering him for several days now. At first he had written it off as stress from a big project, but the pain persisted. Perhaps he should have seen a doctor. That evening, Thomas called his old friend Alex Sorensen. They'd met back in college and, despite their different career paths, had maintained their friendship. Alex became an LAPD detective while Thomas built skyscrapers. "Long time no see, Tommy." Alex's voice sounded tired but sincere. "How are things with you and Susan?" "Everything's fine," Thomas answered automatically. "How about a beer tomorrow night?" Alex agreed to meet at their favorite bar downtown. The next day, Thomas decided to make an appointment with the doctor. The discomfort was getting worse, and a strange burning sensation when urinating began. It could be something serious. "Mr. Garrett," the receptionist smiled at him. "Dr. Fisher will see you in 15 minutes. Dr. Natalie Fisher, a young woman with an attentive gaze and impeccable manners, listened carefully to his complaints. "How long ago did you notice the symptoms?" "About a week ago," Thomas answered. "At first I thought it would go away on its own." She made notes on the chart. "Is there any burning discomfort when you urinate?" Thomas nodded, feeling strangely embarrassed. "We'll run some tests," Dr. Fisher said. "The results will be ready in a few days. In the meantime, I'll prescribe you an antibiotic that should help with your symptoms." As Thomas left the office, he got a call from Susan. "Honey, I'm sorry I'm going to be late again today. Marcus asked me to help with a presentation for a client. Marcus Vale, creative director in the next department. Thomas had met him twice at company parties, a tall, confident man about his age, with gray on his temples and a charming smile. Typical advertising man. "Not a problem," Thomas replied, wondering why Marcus's name made him feel uncomfortable. "I have a meeting with Alex." That evening at the Golden Mile Bar, Thomas waited for his friend, watching a baseball game on the television above the bar. Alex showed up right on time, as always in his worn leather jacket that didn't seem to have changed since college. "You look lousy," Alex said without preamble, sitting down next to me and ordering a beer. "Thanks for the compliment," Thomas grinned. "Tough week." "Tell me about it." "New project? Difficult clients? The usual?" Thomas said evasively. "How was work?" As usual, the city's full of assholes who think they can break the law. They talked about work, mutual acquaintances, sports, the usual topics for two men who had known each other for almost 30 years. Thomas almost dared to share his suspicions, but something stopped him. Saying it out loud meant making it real. "How's Susan?" Alex asked as they ordered their second course. Thomas shrugged. "Busy with work, big project." Alex looked at him carefully. "Is something wrong, Tommy? What makes you think that?" "Detective, remember?" Alex chuckled. You look like you haven't slept in several nights, and every time I mention Susan, you change the subject. Thomas took a sip of beer. I'm not sure. Maybe it's just my fantasy. Do you think she's... I don't know, Thomas interrupted him. I really don't. She stays late at work, gets calls, and goes into the other room to talk. Normal things that could be explained by work, it's just... something's different. Did you talk to her? About what? About how I don't like the way she answers the phone? Thomas shook his head. I feel paranoid. Alex looked at his friend thoughtfully. Look, Tom, I've seen enough marriages fall apart. Sometimes people just drift apart. It doesn't necessarily mean cheating. I know. Thomas rubbed his eyes. Maybe I'm exaggerating. I had an unpleasant conversation with the doctor today, probably just stress. What's wrong? Alex was worried. It's nothing serious, Thomas lied. It's just that age is taking its toll. Look, let's change the subject. Tell me about your last case. Alex took the hint and began to tell about the investigation of the jewelry store theft. Thomas tried to concentrate, but his thoughts kept returning to Susan and her late-night meetings with Marcus Vale. Returning home, Thomas found that Susan had not yet arrived. The clock showed almost midnight. He went to bed but could not sleep, listening to every sound. Finally, around 2 a.m, he heard the front door open. Susan tried to move quietly, but in the silence of the house, every step echoed. When she entered the bedroom, Thomas pretended to be asleep. He heard her removing her clothes, smelled the scent of an unfamiliar cologne as she slipped under the covers. No, this couldn't just be fantasy. Something was definitely going on. In the morning, Thomas decided it was time to take action. He could no longer live in ignorance. If Susan was cheating on him, he wanted to know the truth. The phone call rang on Wednesday as Thomas was holding a meeting with the architecture team. Seeing the clinic's number on the screen, he apologized and walked out of the conference room. Mr. Garrett, this is Dr. Fisher. Your results are in. Can you come in today at 4 o'clock? There was a tension in her voice that made his heart clench. Is it something serious? I'd prefer to discuss it in person. Thomas canceled all his appointments for the afternoon. Something in Dr. Fisher's tone made him more nervous than he'd expected. The doctor's waiting room was quiet. A young nurse avoided his gaze. Dr. Fisher greeted him with a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. Have a seat, Mr. Garrett. She opened the folder containing his results. I don't have good news. Your tests came back positive for HIV infection. Thomas froze. The doctor's words came through the water. There must be a mistake, he finally squeezed out. We ran 2 different tests, Dr. Fisher said softly. The results are confirmed. How is that possible? Thomas hesitated. I've been married for 20 years. Dr. Fisher kept her tone professional. HIV is transmitted through the exchange of bodily fluids, blood, semen, vaginal secretions. The most common routes of transmission are unprotected sexual contact or sharing needles when injecting. Thomas shook his head. I've never used drugs, and I've never cheated on my wife. There was a heavy silence in the office. Dr. Fisher chose her words carefully. Mr. Garrett, I'm not making any assumptions about your personal life. It might be worth discussing the tests with your wife. Thomas felt the blood rush from his face. The suspicions he'd been chasing away for the past weeks had suddenly taken on a frightening shape. What now? HIV is now a chronic disease that can be managed, Dr. Fisher said confidently, as if she were giving a lecture. With modern antiretroviral therapy, patients can live long, full lives. We'll refer you to a specialist for treatment. Thomas nodded without hearing her. There was only one thought in his head. Susan. It had to be her. There was no other explanation. As he left the clinic, he sat in his car and stared at nothing for a long time. The life he'd known was crumbling like a house of cards. HIV. Until a month ago, that word had existed in another universe that had nothing to do with him. Now it defined his future. Thomas pulled out his phone and opened Susan's calendar app. They had set up a shared family calendar years ago to coordinate plans. She'd rarely updated it in recent months, citing that it was easier to keep work meetings on the corporate app. But a few entries were still there, for visibility: client meetings, lunches, presentations, company names, dates, times, a legend covering up something else. He opened her email on a shared tablet. The password hadn't changed in years. Their wedding day. Nothing suspicious at first glance. The usual work correspondence, newsletters, notifications. But in the Sent folder, he found an email from 3 months ago, addressed to Marcus Vale, with a room reservation at the Shangri-La Hotel attached. A business trip that hadn't been discussed at home. At 5 o'clock that evening, Thomas parked in front of the office building where Susan worked. He'd never followed her before, and the feeling was humiliating. But now everything had changed. His life, his health, his future. Everything was at stake. At 6:30, Susan walked out of the building. She was not alone. Marcus Vale was walking beside her, a tall, trim man in an expensive suit. They didn't hold hands, didn't openly show their feelings, but there was an intimacy in their movements, in how close they stood to each other. Thomas followed them at a safe distance. They got into Marcus's car, a silver Lexus, and headed toward the coast. 20 minutes later, they pulled up to a small restaurant in Santa Monica overlooking the ocean. Thomas found a table by the window from where he could watch them while remaining unnoticed. They sat close, talking quietly, occasionally touching hands. At one point, Marcus leaned over and kissed Susan, not passionately, but with the casual tenderness of a long relationship. Thomas felt everything inside go numb. It wasn't the shock. Part of him had known the truth for a long time. Rather, it was the final confirmation, closing the last window of hope. Without waiting for their dinner to end, he left for home. There he opened a bottle of whiskey and drank himself into oblivion for the first time in years. In the morning, he was awakened by Alex's call. "Are you all right?" his friend asked without preamble. "You didn't answer your phone last night." "Yep, not really," Thomas answered honestly, fighting a hangover. "Could we meet tonight?" "Sure, I'll be off after 6. Same bar?" "Yes, thank you." Susan didn't spend the night. She'd sent a text message the night before saying she was staying at a friend's house after the company party. The lie seemed so obvious now that Thomas wondered how he could have believed it before. He opened his laptop and began systematically gathering evidence, reviewed bills, credit card statements, emails, anything that could shed light on the length and depth of the betrayal. The picture that was emerging was overwhelming. Their relationship with Marcus had begun at least a year ago, maybe even earlier. On his way to the bar, Thomas stopped at a gun store. He'd never been interested in guns, but now the idea of owning a gun seemed strangely comforting. The salesman, an older man with a military bearing, showed him several models. "For home defense?" he asked in a businesslike manner. "Yes," Thomas lied. "There have been several robberies in our neighborhood recently. I recommend the Glock 19. It's reliable, easy to use, and most importantly, it won't let you down when you need it." The buying process took longer than Thomas expected. Background checks, filling out forms, waiting for approval. He was almost late for his meeting with Alex. The bar was noisy. The start of the weekend had attracted a lot of customers. Alex had already taken their usual table and ordered a beer. "You look worse than last time," he said when Thomas sat down across from him. "I found out I have HIV." Alex froze with his mug to his mouth. "What?" "The doctor told him yesterday." Thomas spoke calmly, almost emotionlessly. "2 tests, both positive." "God, Tom." Alex put the beer down. "I'm so sorry." "I didn't cheat on Susan," Thomas continued. "Never. So it was her." Alex was silent for a moment, thinking about what he'd heard. "Are you sure? Could there be another explanation? Medical procedures? Blood transfusions?" "Nothing like that. And I followed her yesterday. She's dating a coworker, Marcus Vale." Alex sighed and rubbed his face with his hands. "Tom, I understand how you feel right now, but don't jump to conclusions. Talk to her." "Talk to her about what?" Thomas grinned bitterly. "About the fact that she is sleeping with another man and has infected me with HIV?" "Yes, about that," Alex answered firmly. "Look, I've seen many cases when people made terrible decisions in the moment of emotional crisis. Don't be one of them." Thomas looked at his friend, realizing that he saw him as a potential criminal. It was humiliating and sobering at the same time. "I'm not going to do anything stupid," he said after a pause. "I just need some time to think it over." Do you want to stay at my place for a couple days? Alex suggested. Sometimes distance helps to clear your thoughts. Thanks, but no, I need to talk to Susan. You're right about that. They spent another hour discussing options. Alex was practical, advising them to see a lawyer, to prepare for divorce, to focus on treatment. Thomas nodded, but inside he felt a dark, cold rage growing. Returning home, Thomas found the living room light on. Susan was sitting on the couch, looking something up on her phone. She looked up when he walked in and smiled, habitually, as if nothing had happened. "Hello, darling. How was your day?" Thomas looked at this woman he'd lived half his life with and didn't recognize her. How could she smile at him knowing that she had ruined their lives? "Fine," he replied as he walked past into the study. He pulled the box with the gun out of his bag and hid it in the top drawer of his desk. Then he opened his laptop and compiled a document with a chronology of their relationship and a list of evidence of infidelity. Everything had to be documented. Everything had to make sense. At 1 o'clock in the morning, when Susan was already asleep, he sat in his office looking at a picture of their wedding. Young, happy, full of hope. Where had that happiness gone? At what point had Susan decided their marriage wasn't worth being faithful to? He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a gun. The heavy, cold metal in his hand gave a strange sense of control in a world that had suddenly become chaotic. Thomas hadn't planned to use it. At least that's what he told himself. It was just insurance, protection, from what he himself didn't know exactly. In the morning, he called the office and took a medical leave of absence. Dr. Fisher called at 9 o'clock to see how he was doing and to remind him to see a specialist. "Did you talk to your spouse?" she asked cautiously. "Not yet. I realize it's difficult, but the sooner she gets tested, the better." Thomas agreed and hung up. He needed more information before he confronted Susan. He drove to Marcus Vale's office. The Blue Sky Advertising Agency was located in a modern building with a glass facade. Thomas identified himself as a potential client and asked to see Mr. Vale. The receptionist checked the calendar. "He'd be free in 40 minutes. Is that okay with you?" Thomas agreed and settled into the waiting area, flipping through magazines and watching the agency staff. Among them was Susan, his wife, a stranger with a familiar face. She didn't notice him as she walked past with a folder of documents. Half an hour later, Marcus Vale appeared, well-groomed, confident, radiating success. Thomas watched him talking to his co-workers, laughing, giving directions. The man had slept with his wife, probably loved her, definitely ruined their marriage. Did he know about HIV? Was he the source of the infection or another victim? Thomas canceled the meeting, citing an urgent call, and left. On the way home, he stopped at a gun store and bought ammunition. The salesman showed him how to load the gun, how to take the safety off, how to aim. "I hope you never have to use it for its intended purpose," he said as he wrapped up the purchase. "Me neither," Thomas replied, knowing he was lying. In the evening, he called Alex. "How are you?" his friend asked. "Better," Thomas lied. "You were right. I'll talk to Susan today." "Do you want me to come over?" "No, this is our case. I can handle it." "Be reasonable, Tom. Remember that what's happening now isn't the end of life, just a change in it." "Of course," Thomas agreed. "Thanks for your support, friend." He hung up the phone and looked at his watch. Susan was due back in an hour. He had time to prepare for the conversation that would change everything. Thomas opened his desk drawer and pulled out his gun. He loaded it following the instructions and placed it next to the evidence folder. Then he poured himself a whiskey and waited for his wife to return. Detective Alex Sorensen was finishing paperwork on a burglary case when his phone rang. Maria, who had been with the department for 20 years, spoke briefly and matter-of-factly. "Homicide in Bel Air, Laurel Drive, number 234. Uniforms are on the scene. Suspect is located there as well, offering no resistance." Alex wrote down the address, and only then did something click in his memory. What was the address again? Laurel Drive, 234, Thomas and Susan Garrett's address. Alex's heart skipped a beat. "I'm on my way," he said, already grabbing his jacket. "Let them know I'll be there in 20 minutes. He tried to call Thomas on the way, but his friend's phone went straight to voicemail. Alex drove the squad car, ignoring the speed limits, turning on the siren and flashing beacons. He'd known Thomas for 30 years. Seen him at the peak of his career and in his moments of failure. Best man at his wedding. Couldn't believe he was capable of violence, but their last conversation now sounded ominous. I'll talk to Susan today. Alex should have realized, sensed the danger in his friend's voice. When he pulled up to the Garrett house, 3 patrol cars and an ambulance were already there. The immaculate lawn was being trampled by police officers. Curious neighbors gathered behind the fencing tape. A typical murder scene of which Alex had seen hundreds. But this time was different. Detective Sorensen, he introduced himself to the young patrolman guarding the entrance. Suspect is inside, sir. No resistance. Just says he'll talk to you. Did he call my name? Yes, sir. Said you were friends. Alex nodded and entered the house. The spacious living room, which he knew well from his many visits, looked different now. Overturned furniture, broken photographs on the floor, traces of blood on the light-colored carpet. Thomas sat in a chair across from the couch, where a sheet-covered body lay. His hands were cuffed, his face blank and impassive. A police officer stood nearby, 2 others examining the crime scene. It's okay, Alex told the officer. I'll talk to him. When they were relatively alone, as much as possible at a crime scene, Alex sat down on the edge of the coffee table across from Thomas. What's wrong, Tom? He asked quietly. Thomas looked up. His eyes were red but dry. I killed her, Alex. I killed Susan. His voice sounded calm, like he was talking about the weather. Tell me everything. Alex turned on the recorder on his phone and placed it on the table between them. This is a recording for the record, Tom. You have the right to an attorney. I don't need a lawyer. Thomas shook his head. I'm not going to deny what I did. Alex knew he should read Thomas his rights, that he should call another detective, that his friendship with the suspect created a conflict of interest. But he couldn't leave his friend alone with the other cops. Not now. She got home around 8, Thomas began. I waited for her in the study. I had a folder with evidence of her infidelity, photos I'd taken when I'd followed her, printouts of their correspondence, hotel statements. And there was a gun. A Glock 19. I bought it yesterday. Alex nodded without interrupting. Inwardly, he cursed himself for not realizing the gravity of the situation sooner. I called her into the office, Thomas continued. I showed her the file. I asked her how long she'd been sleeping with Marcus Vale. She denied it at first. Then, when I showed her the photos, she started making excuses. Said our marriage had been empty for a long time, that I was always more preoccupied with work than with her. Standard excuses. He fell silent, looking at his cuffed hands. And then I asked about HIV. Asked if she knew. And you should have seen the look on her face, Alex. Thomas grinned bitterly. She knew. She had known for months. Marcus infected her and she infected me. You didn't use protection? Alex asked, trying to keep his tone professional. We've been married for 20 years, Thomas shrugged. We tried to have a child in the early years of our marriage. It didn't work out. Then she told me she was on the pill. I trusted her. Alex wrote down the statement, feeling the professional part of his mind fighting the personal one. His friend had just confessed to the murder, but all Alex felt was a deep sadness. What happened after she confessed? She started crying, said she wanted to tell me, but she was afraid. That she loved me in her own way, but she'd been unhappy for a long time. That I shouldn't blame Marcus. He didn't know about HIV when they started dating either. He only found out a couple months ago. Thomas took a deep breath. And then she told me she was going to leave me for him. That they'd discussed it, and he was willing to take her in, despite her illness. She'd already consulted a lawyer about a divorce. The room became quiet. All you could hear was the forensics team talking and cameras clicking. I didn't plan to kill her, Alex. I swear to you. The gun was, more of a symbol, a way to feel in control in a situation where I'd completely lost it. But you fired, Alex said quietly. Yeah, when she said I got what I deserved. That if I'd been a better husband, more attentive, more passionate, she'd never have looked at another. That my illness was payback for years of neglect. Thomas looked up at his friend. I don't even remember pulling the gun. All I remember is her surprised face and then the shot. She collapsed on the couch. I went over to her thinking maybe there was something else I could do. But it was too late. I sat down in that chair and called 911. I told them I'd killed my wife. Alex recorded the statement and turned off the recorder. The procedure called for the suspect to be immediately handed over to other officers, to call in a homicide detective who wasn't personally connected to him. "You know what happens next?" he said instead. "Yes," Thomas nodded. "It's probably for the best. Living with HIV, the loneliness, losing everything I've built. Maybe prison is exactly what I deserve." "Don't say that," Alex stepped forward. "Listen to me, Tom. What you've done is terrible. It's irreparable. But your life is not over. Modern medicine has done wonders for HIV. You can live a long life. Behind bars," Thomas said bitterly. "Maybe not for life. The state of passion, the betrayal, the lack of a criminal record, all these are mitigating circumstances." Alex knew he shouldn't give false hope, but he couldn't bear to see the utter despair in his friend's eyes. "You need a good lawyer, and Tom, you need to start treatment. Right now." Thomas nodded, but it was obvious his thoughts were somewhere far away. "You know what's ironic, Alex? I still love her. Even now, even after everything she's done." Alex felt a lump come up to his throat. He stood up and called the officer over. "Hand the suspect over to Detective Ramirez when he arrives. I'm recusing myself from the case due to a personal conflict of interest." The officer nodded and walked over to Thomas. "Stand up, please." Thomas stood up. Before the officer led him away, he looked at Alex. "Take care of the funeral, will you? She doesn't have any close relatives." "I promise," Alex said, and at that moment he felt tears come to his eyes. As Thomas was led away, Alex walked over to the couch. The medical examiner had just finished examining the body and authorized its transportation. "May I?" Alex asked, pointing to the sheet. The expert nodded. Alex carefully lifted the edge. Susan looked almost peaceful, except for a small bullet hole in the center of her chest. Blood caked on her white blouse, forming a dark red stain. Alex remembered their last meeting at Christmas dinner 6 months ago. She'd been cheerful, joking around a lot, asking him about work. Nothing had foreshadowed the abyss into which they'd all collapsed. He lowered the sheet and stepped back, giving the orderlies a chance to place the body in the bag. Detective Ramirez, an older Mexican man with tired eyes, showed up 10 minutes later. "Sorensen," he nodded. "I hear you know the suspect?" "We've been friends since college," Alex admitted. "I'm recusing myself from the investigation." "I understand. What do you know?" he confessed. "Full confessions on a tape recorder. I'll transfer the file. Murder by passion. His wife cheated on him, gave him HIV. During the confrontation, he shot her in the chest with a gun he bought the day before." Ramirez wrote down the information. "Are you okay?" he asked, looking at Alex's pale face. "I will be," he replied. "I just never thought I'd be on this side of the barrier, you know?" Ramirez nodded understandingly. "Go home, Sorensen. Have a drink. Get some sleep. We'll take care of business." Alex stepped out of the house into the fresh evening air. The sky over Los Angeles was clear, the stars bright. A normal night in the City of Angels. Somewhere now, people were dining in restaurants, laughing, falling in love, and 2 of his friends, one dead, the other soon to be in jail. In the car, Alex found a missed call from Thomas, made half an hour before the murder. No message. Just a call he hadn't answered because he was busy filing a report on a minor theft case. Could things have ended differently if he had answered? If he'd insisted on coming over? If he'd rather heard the desperation in his friend's voice when they'd talked this afternoon? Alex started the car and headed to the station. He had a ton of paperwork to fill out, explain his involvement in the case, hand over the confession tape. Standard procedure, except that there was nothing standard about this situation. Captain Donovan met him at the station. "Sorensen," he called. "My office, please." Alex followed him, already knowing what the conversation would be about. "Do you realize that your involvement in this case creates serious problems?" began the captain as soon as the door closed. "Yes, sir. I pulled back as soon as I realized the suspect was a friend of mine. After I recorded his confession without a lawyer and without a partner. He didn't want a lawyer and was willing to confess to any officer." The captain sighed. "Look, Alex, I realize you're in a difficult situation, but everything has to be by the book, especially in cases like this. The defense could use your friendship with the suspect to challenge the confession." "He won't challenge it," Alex said confidently. He's fully aware of what he's done. And yet, I'm removing you from any involvement in this case, officially. Hand the tape over to Ramirez and go home. Take a couple days off. Alex nodded. He hadn't expected any other decision. After all the paperwork was done, he drove home. On the way, he stopped at a convenience store and bought a bottle of whiskey. For the first time in a long time, Alex felt the need to get drunk. At home, he poured himself a double portion and sat down in the dark living room. Thomas's face stood before his eyes, devastated, lifeless, and Susan, dead, with a neat hole in her chest. The phone rang. Jennifer, his ex-wife. Alex? I saw the news. Thomas Garrett is a friend of yours, isn't he? Yes, was all he could answer. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Are you okay? Not really. Do you want me to come over? They'd been divorced for 3 years, but they were still friends. Other times he would have said no, but now the thought of spending the night alone was unbearable. If it's not too much trouble. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Jennifer arrived with the food and sat silently next to him on the couch. Didn't ask any questions, just was there for him. Alex was grateful for that. I could have prevented it, he said finally. I knew he was in trouble. I knew he suspected his wife of cheating on him. He even told me about HIV, and I just told him to talk to her. Idiot. You couldn't have known, Jennifer objected softly. And talking was the right advice. The problem wasn't that he talked to her. It was that he had a gun, which he bought yesterday. Alex shook his head. If I suspected something, I could have checked it out. It's that simple. Stop it. Jennifer took his hand. You're not to blame for other people's decisions, Alex. Thomas made his choice. A terrible, tragic choice, but it was his choice, not yours. Alex knew she was right, and yet he couldn't shake the guilt. The next day, he had to visit Thomas in the detention center. What would he say to his friend? How would he look into the eyes of a man he couldn't help in his time of need? He also had to organize Susan's funeral, make sure she was cremated as she wanted. Thomas had mentioned it once in a conversation. Contact her colleagues, her friends, perhaps with her lover, who was also a victim in this situation. Life went on despite the tragedy. The city outside the window lived its life. In the morning, Alex would be back to work, investigating other crimes, catching other criminals. But something had changed irrevocably. The line between his work and personal life, between bad guys and good guys, between right and wrong, everything has become blurred, uncertain. Thomas Garrett, his best friend, has become a murderer. How quickly a man's life can be shattered, reduced to rubble by a single impulsive decision, Alex thought, and how easily it could happen to anyone.